And so let's look at the guidelines then from that perspective. In this talk, we're emphasizing the method. And so you could easily get stuck on, well, I've got to do the method just right. But it's always a relationship. And that means, unlike certain other disciplines, if you don't do it correctly, it doesn't matter. It's a help if you do it correctly. But it doesn't matter because it's your intention that counts, and the relationship is with God. And God sees that you're trying hard to do a nice job, the best you can, however much you're stumbling. He's not going to hold your mistakes against you. He's looking at your love, and through another person or a book or eventually or through the inspirations of the Holy Spirit, you'll correct whatever mistakes you're doing. The main thing to do is to do it. The principal method of centering prayer really is to sit down. Now that isn't too hard for most people. Once you sit down, then the Spirit has sort of got you, especially if you're determined to sit there for the 20-25 minutes that you have agreed upon. And if you do that every day, then your mistakes or misconceptions will gradually evaporate. Doing it is the primarily discipline. But there's ways of doing it that could facilitate this sitting there. And so let's look at the guidelines. Now, the first guideline is choose a sacred word as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within you. Notice, please, God's presence and action. So we're working with a dynamic relationship, a back and forth, an exchange, a conversation which has moved towards communion or is moving in that direction. The second little guideline is that sitting comfortably and with eyes closed, we settle briefly, like I'm settling in this nice chair, breathing easily and so on. And then after a few moments of not doing anything, just sort of settling, pausing, maybe 10 or 15 seconds of quiet, you introduce very gently, very casually, almost informally, the sacred word that you had chosen in the first guideline that symbolizes the consent of your will to God's presence and action within. They always go together. God is not a statue. He's not a static force within us. It's a loving relationship in faith, and hence God's Spirit can do all kinds of things and suggests all kinds of things, and he does. The third guideline is, when engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. Well, this is just to say, or acknowledge the fact that there are going to be various thoughts, feelings, sense perceptions, noise in the room, people coughing, memories, imaginations, visualizations, sort of dreaming. All of this psychological material, you might say, is going to be flowing down the stream of consciousness as you sit there. And we say that it's inevitable, integral, and normal. So this is a terribly important point to get through our heads if we've been trained in the doctrine of distractions, that distractions somehow are harmful or interfere with your prayer. Now, if you're doing discursive meditation when you're supposed to be thinking about something particular, then other thoughts are distractions, do interrupt your reflection and your prayer. But the centering prayer moves beyond that level of awareness. And it's designed to disregard the ordinary thoughts or activities of our psychological day-to-day awareness. So you're not on the level that you're usually on in discursive meditation. And hence, we just disregard this thought, or these thoughts which are more like noise in the street or background music at the supermarket that you put up with but pay no attention to. But it's important not to resist these thoughts. In other words, it's important to have a joyful attitude towards the thoughts, a friendly attitude towards the most dreadful thoughts. Not that you linger over them or act them out, but it's important that we expect them, and they're normal, and they're integral, and so we receive them all with a smile, sort of inward smile, so to speak. A jolly attitude is recommended. Here they go again, that sort of thing. Ha, ha, ha. Reason for that is that any emotional frustration or annoyance or distress or grief is not appropriate, because that is another kind of thought. Because it's emotionally charged, it's more of a hindrance to entering into interior silence, which is the proximate goal of this prayer, than any number of casual thoughts that go by. So as soon as you're annoyed, you have a second thought, which is much more disturbing than the first one. And so there really is great wisdom in taking for granted there's going to be lots of thoughts and endless thoughts, and that with practice you can disregard most of them. At the third one, which is perhaps the most crucial one for most of us, when engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. We said that thoughts are inevitable. We said they were integral. In other words, they're a part of the prayer. And as far as we can tell from our present level of experience, they're integral because your thoughts may be coming from the unconscious and may be part of the process of healing that I'll come to later in my next lecture, as the Spirit works as a kind of divine therapist. And one of the ways that he heals the unconscious is by allowing its feelings and its thoughts to surface, especially during prayer, and then later sometimes outside the time of prayer. But it is precisely the programs in the unconscious, or what psychology calls the dynamics of the unconscious, that hinder the free flow of grace and hence need to be addressed by the Spirit, brought to our attention, and we have to let go of them, both in our prayer and the consequences of them in daily life. So that you can see right away that the centering prayer involves the whole of life and the activity by which we bring its fruits into daily life is almost as important a factor in the project as the actual time that we faithfully spend each day in the prayer itself. It works somewhat like this. Suppose you were in deep conversation with someone you loved, and high up in an apartment house, and the windows are open, the traffic is going by, and the noise you can't stop. But all of a sudden there's a crash in the street, and the decibels go up, and you naturally feel a curiosity to go see what happens. Well, this is what happens when interesting thoughts or boats come down the stream of consciousness. We want to look at them, or what are we going to have for supper, and so on. And then as your mind begins to look at this thing, or as, let us say, the young man begins to go to the window to see what the accident was, he suddenly remembers, oh, what am I doing? I'm in this deep cheek-to-jowl conversation, heart-to-heart conversation. I'm not interested in, it's not a time to go see what's happening outside or to judge what we're really going to have for dinner. And so you want to reinforce or reaffirm the original tete-a-tete that you were having. And so what would you do? You would turn your eyes back towards the beloved, your friend, as a gesture of renewing the conversation from where it got somewhat disturbed. Or you might say, excuse me. Or you might say, as I was saying. Well, that's what the sacred word does for you. It's when you are lifted out of your basic intention and start watching thoughts that you're attached to or have an aversion to, that you need to do something to return to the sacred word. But if the thoughts are just going by like noise in the supermarket and you're not paying any attention to it, you're just dimly aware that it's happening, then there isn't a necessity to go back to the sacred word, because you're already at the place that the sacred word is meant to facilitate your reaching, which is the abiding, turning, and resting in the presence of God within you at the deepest level. So let me just sum up very briefly in this modest diagram here what I'm trying to say. Suppose that this is our ordinary awareness, the stream of consciousness that we're experiencing during the time of prayer. And here are a few boats that are going by, boats representing thoughts, feelings, images, and so on, and there's usually a fleet of them. Sometimes the whole United States Navy seems to be going down with all the guns banging and so on. So whatever your experience, you're having thoughts going by at this level. At a deeper level, let's call this the ordinary level of our awareness, and let's call this the spiritual level of our awareness, which you're really not aware of most of the time except at a peak experience or when life or tragedy or something brings you to that place. So we're mostly unaware of what might be called the river itself on which all our thoughts and faculties are resting. So we're kind of absorbed or dominated in our ordinary psychological life by the objects of events and people and our emotional reactions to them. The purpose then of the centering prayer is to move from this level to this level. And indeed, not to stop there, because the human being has greater depths than that, but to move even deeper to the level of the true self, which is our participation in the divine life, and the divine presence itself as the source of our being at every level. And it's accessing or awakening our awareness to this presence that is the ultimate goal of contemplative prayer or centering prayer. But to reach it, we have to pass through the spiritual level and to awaken the true self and whatever of God's ultimate divine presence he may want to share with us, which is a whole new life, which is a transformed life, and which it seems to me is what the gospel invites us to, especially in St. John, where Jesus speaks of inviting us into the same union and unity that he experiences with the Father in the Holy Spirit. Hence, this is so important, again, from the perspective of prayer as relationship. Now, there are lots of prayers at this level, our vocal prayers, our reflections, and our divine office, and the sacraments. But each of these things, especially the sacraments, has this mystical depth, or this mystagogic teaching, which helps us to understand the symbols of the Church from this level, in which they're transformed and their meaning becomes immensely more powerful, more attractive, and more personal, as well as, at the same time, bonding us with everyone else who is having a similar experience in grace. And that, we might say that the centering prayer is primarily involved in awakening this particular level as a preparation for going deeper still, which is the work of the various stages of contemplative prayer and mystical life.